Unprecedented step of decriminalizing all drugs in small amounts. Let's talk about it with Fiona Harrigan from Young Voices, who's up late with me again on the Final Five. Fiona, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote an op-ed for the Arizona Daily Star because marijuana was on the ballot in Arizona. Many states, it was on the ballot, and it passed. And it's amazing these changing attitudes in the last 15 to 20 years across the country. But it's not just about getting high here.
That's right. So there are a number of other criminal justice measures that have been kind of enveloped into a lot of these legalization bills that we've passed recently. In Arizona specifically, there was an expungement allowance. And expungement effectively means that those who were convicted of low-level possession charges for marijuana, they can now apply to have those charges removed from their records. And given that Arizona possession of anything under 2 pounds of marijuana counts as a felony, there have been plenty of felons here for possessing no more than 2 ounces of marijuana. And now we're going to see this interesting trend of people regaining their civil liberties. And that's something that's already been in progress across the country in a number of places as well.
And especially, too, I mean, it's something that we have seen play out here. I mean, D.C.'s set up as a bit convoluted because you have Congress who has a say in the matter. And right now you can't walk into a store and you can't go to a dispensary in D.C. because there are none. But there was a byline in the op-ed, which it said, on top of getting high, some may now be able to get by. And it doesn't just apply to Arizona because, as we mentioned, Oregon really took this to an entirely new dimension where they basically said all drugs, hard drugs, but in small amounts, they're not going to put them through this rigorous legal process anymore.
I do think it's an interesting tide that's happening, and Oregon has always been on the front lines of this sort of thing. But I think a lot of people are coming to realize that the war on drugs has largely been a failure, a policy failure, and that a lot of the people who are negatively affected by this come from communities of color. And it's kind of the perfect continuation of this summer of demands for racial justice, that this is sort of where we've ended up in drug policy terms.
Especially, too, in many of these cases where it has been the will of the voters, and as mentioned here in D.C. just a few weeks ago, the same day that we saw all of these measures pass in other states, in D.C., they decriminalized hallucinogenic mushrooms. There was a mother who spearheaded this effort here to legalize, or at least decriminalize that, make it a low priority crime to prosecute, because she said she found them beneficial in her recovery from various ailments. And I think, Fiona, that's one of the things here that as the years go by, as we move past the Nancy Reagan Say No to Drugs era of the 80s, there's been so much research put out there that says, you know, yes, some people get high, they get a kick off some of these, but there are many drugs that provide a medical or psychological benefit.
It's really amazing what people have been able to do in terms of therapy for PTSD, for sleeping disorders, even as cancer treatment. Marijuana has been really instrumental. So you see a number of states legalizing medical use, but also recreational use. Currently, there are 15 states plus Washington, D.C. that allow recreational use, and I believe it's close to 33 at this point that allow for medical usage. So 1 in 3 Americans now live in a state where recreational marijuana is legal, and this momentum is really built to such an extent that at this point, 2/3 of Americans support marijuana legislation and legalization at national and a broad level. So it's really going to be a sea change for me here. And given how many states opted to legalize marijuana both recreationally and medically this past election day, it'll be really interesting to see what it looks like a couple years from now.
Do you think that changing tide will eventually convince anybody on Capitol Hill? I mean, I know there have been measures here and there and pushes to enact various legislation, because I know it's tough when it comes to marijuana where legal dispensaries operating legally, you know, can't process credit card transactions, for example. Are we going to see anything on the federal level, do you think, in the near future, or is that still a ways off?
Given how many states are moving that direction already, I think it's likely a matter of time, and I hope that it's a couple years matter of time as opposed to a couple of decades. You know, like I said, I think a lot of people are realizing the futility of these things and just how costly and damaging the war on drugs has been over the years. And as people my age, as millennials and Gen Xers, are the ones making policies, as opposed to people of my grandparents' generation, it's much more likely that we're going to see a more compassionate approach.
I don't believe that President-elect Biden is on board with this idea yet, but we'll see where it goes from here. Fiona Harrigan, great to see you again.
Great to see you.
Final Five comes back after this.